So, I have a big topic to share with you guys, and I'm not going to fit it all into this video, but I figure I might as well start somewhere and just start sharing, start communicating these ideas. So, the idea for today is creation. Now, I think a place to start with that is to understand that when we're talking about creation, right, in terms of an infinite universe or in terms of an eternal universe, right, there is no creation. There is no beginning, there is no end. If that is our understanding, that, the universe is infinite, is eternal, then there cannot be a beginning or an end. Now there can be cycles, of course. There can be sort of beginnings and ends, you might call them, or just really these transition points, right? Like a wave of energy has its crests and its troughs. But it's, in the big picture, the grand reality is that there is no beginning. That being said, right, we can kind of have this sort of understanding of this sort of creation process, right? So we begin with this infinitude, right? In the beginning, there is, right, this infinite, eternal substance, this infinite love, this infinite density, this infinite vacuum. We can apply many words to it, and our words will never quite touch its true identity because it's beyond our true conception, because we are, in essence, within that. We are finite perspectives trying to understand the totality that gave rise to our experience. And so it's sort of something that can never really be attained. But what we can do is use concepts from our experience to at least try and point to an understanding of that initial source. And so again, that initial source was void. That initial source was, unpolarized. There was no spectrum. There is no spectrum because, it is still existing. There is, again, this just eternal infinitude that is without description or definition. That being said, somehow we little human beings are having this experience, and so we have to try and understand how this experience could arise from that infinite void, okay, or that infinite totality, because really that's saying the same thing. It's infinite. So I think a place to start is by saying that the infinitude moved, right? Or the infinitude expressed itself, or the infinitude began to spin, or it began to polarize itself, or the infinitude looked upon itself, or the infinitude reflected itself. All of these things are really describing the same sort of motion when you're talking in infinite terms. All of those things would have this same sort of result. And so I think, a word that I really like to use and prefer to use because it has the most kind of value in its concept and what it describes is the word polarization. Okay, so really quickly, the word polarized, it just means the creation of opposing essences or the creation of an axis of spin or a flow through center or a linear motion. All of those things are kind of describing this concept of polarization. So, you know, a real life kind of understanding is with a magnet, right? Magnets are polarized. They have this sort of north and south pole, which is really just, you know, they have an axis of spin and two perspectives in which to view that spin. Okay? So, the infinite universe polarized itself infinitely, right? Because it is this infinite universe. And so, you know, the moment you have one single polarization, you know, again, this is all just for the contemplation of it, but you could see how there would be this instantaneous sort of domino effect, this instantaneous chain reaction, where the moment you create that single motion, the moment the universe has this idea, it all instantaneously unfolds, right? Or it all instantaneously manifests, you might say. And so this manifestation is without time, and thereby you could say it's without space. It is just this pure sort of potential of infinitude arising or manifesting in a single moment. Because again, we are without time and we are without space at this point in our understanding and creation, right? I'm trying to kind of give this sort of, I don't know, time-lapse perspective or frame-by-frame understanding of this process. And again, this is just a conceptualizing process, because the reality is that everything that I'm describing is an instantaneous, you know, isness. It just is, right? It already is existing and has always existed in this way. So we are beyond relativity at this point in our understanding, in my description that I'm sharing with you guys. Okay, so you have the infinite source, and that infinite source becomes polarized. It reflects itself, okay? It interacts with itself and creates this infinite spectrum of information, you might say. So, those points of polarization, right, the nodal points of that sort of infinite pattern of source, of light, you might say, right? We can apply that term light to that manifest creation. That's actually a good word to use, because it's kind of like, you know, we had the void, we had the stillness, we had the you know, the nothingness, the everythingness, the totality that was undefined, and then that totality, that source, became definable, right? It's not that it became defined, it's that it became definable. And so it became this spectrum. And so I like to, numbers have played a big role in my experience, and so I like to relate to the idea of numbers, and where you know, on a number line, you know, you have the number line itself, right? This infinite line. It is, you know, you could relate that to the void. And then you have this sort of manifestation of potential upon that number line, and that would really be just this, you know, kind of 0 point, and so on either side of that 0 point, this polarity, this positive and negative infinitude. And so when you do that, you can see that contained within that positive and negative infinitude, there is, you know, once you put that 0 point there, once you create that polarization, instantaneously you have, you know, all of this potential information, and you can see that there is, you know, one, you can start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to infinitude, and then you can see within each one of those points, in between 0 and 1, there is again another infinitude, and you can count, point 11111 forever and 0.99999 forever. And so even, you can take it further and further and further and basically see that there is this sort of infinite nesting of infinitude, but it all arose the moment you polarized that initial infinite line. So through this act of polarization, the potential for information is created. Okay? Now, each one of those polarized aspects, each one of those 0 points, you might say, could really be understood to be a soul, to be a life expression, to be a spirit, to be an awareness. All right? So, every star has this polarized essence and has this awareness. Every planet would have this polarized awareness. Every atom, every cell, and every living being, all forms of life have this sort of polarized awareness. Okay? And so now, right, we're at the point of life, and this is just a fast sort of overview, again, of this creation process. But once we're at this polarized awareness of life, and I'm saying that word in a very general way, because the reality is that, like I said, like an atom has life to it. An atom has consciousness to it. Just because it's not in the realm of our kind of mental processing, right, of the brain, of this, physical apparatus that we as, mammals and, that we have, just because it's not in that realm of consciousness doesn't mean that it is not, the essence of it isn't consciousness. It is, everything is consciousness, right? You don't, I don't know, consciousness doesn't just arise out of thin air, out of unconscious components. So consciousness requires this polarization, this interaction between or with that 0 point, the awareness, you might say. It's like an eye, right? So an eye, all the light, all the information is flowing through the pupil of that eye. So there is a sort of singularity, you might say, to that eye. I mean, it's the same concept as a black hole. Really, black holes, and I'm getting a little off topic, but I'm just going to go with it. And this might be a longer video, but I think, it'll be worth it to just kind of share all these things in the same sort of context. So, something to be understood in terms of black holes, right? Physics talks about black holes as these astrological, I don't know, systems in the universe. They're on a cosmological scale. They're these large systems in which they have such a large density that their gravity is so great that light cannot escape a certain event horizon. Okay. However, and I'm not going to go into all the science of it in this video, but there is science kind of showing that its gravity can be understood. Well, I take that back. Black holes can be understood as kind of these singularities and these points of what you might call infinite gravity on all scales. Okay? And it's only through the sort of outside relative interaction with these points of gravity or these black holes that we are able to distinguish their sort of relative masses. And again, these ideas basically relate to the work of Nassim Haramein, and he's not the only one, but he's just the biggest name in terms of this understanding. And I can't explain it all here, but you'll have to go look at Nassim's work, right? And his Schwarzschild proton, that's the paper that really, the first one that kind of gets into this topic. So, let's bring it back, all right, to terms of creation. So, we have these polarized points of awareness, okay, or these polarized points of consciousness. And that can be anything from an atom, it could be even a crystal would have some sort of awareness. And that could be understood just in the sense that there is a vibratory interaction between that crystal and its environment. There is a polarized flow of energy through every atom of that crystal and through the larger crystalline structure, through the atomic clusters of that crystal. There is a coherent sort of structure, a coherent greater awareness to that crystal. So it's not just on the atomic scale. We can kind of see there is a larger coherency, a larger awareness, you might say. And then beyond that, you have kind of basic cellular life, and then we can kind of go through the whole evolutionary unfoldment all the way up to the higher minds, the mammals in essence, and birds to some extent, but basically these animals that have greatly developed their brains. So let's see. We have so we have the infinite polarizing, forming these points of awareness, right, on infinite spectrum, meaning going all the way up to infinitely large and all the way down to infinitely small. There is this spectrum of points of awareness. Now those points of awareness can begin to assimilate through a feedback process a sort of compilation or a sort of what's the word? A sort of self-awareness. But really, when we're talking at the most fundamental levels, basically that polarized perspective, is interacting with the totality, all right? And there is a feedback in that interaction that begins to create a sort of identity for that point of awareness. So, you can kind of see this so there's a shape called a torus, and it's the donut shape. So you've all seen a donut, and that shape is really a very potent and profound shape, and we kind of can see it all throughout this creation. It is almost, you could say, the most fundamental pattern. That is the pattern of polarization, is this torus shape. And so that shape, it's very kind of symbolically, but also geometrically, it's very similar to this idea of the sphere, right? The ball, where the ball or the sphere has infinite vertices on its surface, right? Infinite points on its surface. So like a cube would have 8 vertices, 8 corners, kind of, you might say 8 corners interacting with its environment, and then perhaps 6 faces, and those are its planes of interaction. Whereas the sphere, you could say, has infinite vertices or even infinite faces upon its surface. You could also say it has 0 vertices, or it has 1 face upon its surface. So the torus is very similar to the sphere, except the torus is very unique in that not only is it interacting infinitely outward, but it also interacts infinitely towards its center. So literally it's if you drew a line outward from every theoretical point on the surface of that torus, you would draw a line in every single direction, even to the center of that torus, right? To the center of the donut, where the hole is in the donut. So the only places that the line, well, actually no, yeah, there would be no place that a line did not pass through, because one side of the inner part of the donut would draw a line directly through the other side of the inner part of the donut. Anyways, so it's a very profound shape, and again, that's a kind of a concept to help understand that point of awareness, that 0 point, that polarization. All right, so the next step, and this again very simplified, but the next step in this process would be, again, that feedback between that motion through center, that point of awareness, and the greater infinitude, the environment. And that feedback process could said to be occurring through space and time. So this, once we have awareness, once we have a perspective, then we can insert these concepts of space and time, because those are, once you have awareness, you sort of have this duality, or this kind of night and day, black and white perspective, because it's a singular perspective viewing the totality. And so it's sort of by necessity, it has to have this sort of contrast to receive information, to have that feedback of information. And you guys can you can look up information theory, and that's a very potent idea, where it's just this idea that to have information, you must have contrast. You must have a 0 and a 1, right? So computers, they process with bits of information, which a bit could just be understood as a 0 and a 1. And so when you organize bits in a certain way, you can begin to store information. And so, one thing to understand with that, so you have to, like I said, you have to have, you have to have polarization, a black-white, a 0-1, whatever, to process and communicate information. But something else that's very important is you have to have a perspective. You have to have something, or someone, or some consciousness to receive or communicate that information. So then we get into the 3, and that's kind of relates to these ideas of perhaps the Trinity, and the triangle is kind of the most basic geometric shape that contains space, that contains information, you might say. And so there's lots of things to connect it to. But gotta stay on task here, stay on our topic. So with creation, all right, we're kind of at this point, this feedback process where life is beginning to kind of have this self-awareness, this self-identity. And so, at that point, we're no longer, our awareness begins to lack in its purity, or at least it can lack in its purity. Because you can still have that sort of pure, perfected awareness of infinitude, but it just so happens that, on this physical plane of life interaction, because of this interaction, because of this evolutionary process, we are very restricted in our awareness and perception. Fear plays a very large role in that, and it's there's so many tangents that we can go on and kind of talk about fear and its role in this process, and you could kind of fear relates to this idea of darkness, and it's kind of this fear and this darkness that has pushed this more that has pushed evolution along on this seemingly finite plane of existence. All right, I'm going to try and wrap it up because there's so many places and so many things we can go and talk about with this, but I want to give just a kind of a foundational, understanding that you guys can kind of build upon with your own contemplation and your own studying. So a recap, right? I can put it, very simply in that you have this infinite source. That infinite source has an idea, or that infinite source moves, interacts with itself, and creates this polarized spectrum of, that is the universe. And then the individual awarenesses or individual, 0 points of consciousness within that universe begin to assimilate their awareness and create a perspective of that universe, and yeah, and that is kind of this consciousness that we know of in this life. So let me try one more time, even simpler. You have the source, you have the idea, right? Meaning you have the source, you have the creation, right? You have the source, you have the unfoldment, you might say, and then you have the awareness of that unfoldment. And again, we have another kind of triad that we can kind of relate, in different religious traditions. They have these kind of triads, and I won't get specific, but again, everything is interrelating, and so it's really, we have to connect the dots. We have to connect these patterns and see what these interrelating patterns are painting for us as far as an understanding of the universe. So, very simply, creation is this process of the source unfolding, and then that unfoldment having a feedback perception.